Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to the next lesson of our Spring Security course. So, this lesson is the foundation for the authorization workflows and the framework within the Spring Security. So, in our previous lessons, we talked about the authentication where you provide your username and password, and then Spring Security determine whether these credentials are valid credentials or not. So the authorization process is the next step of our entire security workflow, where once you are authenticated, the authorization process will take that information and then decide whether whatever you are requesting, are you authorized for that one or not. So let's take a simple example where we have an organization, and organization have a different things. For example, administrators, finance peoples, a software engineering department, or an IT department, and other departments. So definitely some of the data which the financial peoples are working will not be available for the IT people, right? But once we are logged in, and let's say you try to access the financial information and you are not authorized, that's where the authorization framework will get into the picture. Though you are logged in with your valid username and password, but based upon your rules, based upon your granted authorities, you are not allowed to access that information. Okay. So this is going to be, as I said, this is the foundation of the authorization framework, and we start building our lessons on top of it. All right. So I hope that you already understood how the authentication frameworks and the workflows take into account. All right. So the entry point for the entire authorization framework is the filter security interceptor. Again, this is an interceptor chain or a filters which we have talked about earlier in this one. This is the filter which is responsible to initiate the authorization framework. Okay. And we are interested into the abstract security interceptor. So let me increase the size a little bit. All right. So our security interceptor will delegate the authorization process to the access decision manager, right? So if you see, this is being injected into our abstract security interceptor, and don't worry, we will try to debug it and go through the each and every steps. Okay. Now within the access decision managers, let's see how they are using the access security decision manager. All right. So if you see, this is where we get the authentication. Okay. So if there is an authentication error, you will never get to this step because there will be a authentication exception. So you will be redirected back to the login page, or you will get an error message. So let's say everything else working fine. You provided your valid username and password, you are authenticated. So if you remember from our previous lessons, authentication is nothing but it contains few information: the user who has been authenticated, and then let's open our custom user service for a better understanding. Okay. This is our user detail service. If you remember, this user service is used by the authentication provider, and then what it does is it creates the user information. The interesting thing which it fills is this granted authority. So this information tells the Spring Security what are the authorities that has been carried out, or what are the authorities that are available for this specific user, right? So the authentication framework will not use these authorities. All they are doing is during the authentication process, they just fill out the information, and this is up to us how do we want to fill this collection. Okay. Now this information will be stored as part of the authenticated data, which we are seeing here. So if you open this one, right, as part of this one of the thing which is of our interest is the get authorities. Where we are filling our get authorities is in this. Okay. Right. Now how they are related is, if I use the open the user detail service, right, this user detail service is being used by this internally by this authentication object. Okay. And I have talked about this in my previous lessons, so you can go ahead and watch those lessons. All right, so now what is going to happen is, now our access decision manager will decide whether this given principal or this given user have an access to a requested information or not. So for example, you are going to a specific page and you are not authorized, and how do I identify whether you are authorized or not? That is based upon the authorities, the set of the authorities that has been given to that has been provided to a given user. Now it basically call this decide method, and then it identified whether you have access or not. Okay, so what we are passing here is authentication object. Then this is the object which is the current context. I will be talking about this in our later chapter because it contains a lot of information, but this is just an introductory part. Okay, one of the interesting thing which you, if you have noticed, is this method doesn't have any return time. Okay, there is no boolean value which says okay whether you are authorized or not. All it does is, if you are authorized, everything works fine, you go to the next step. But if you are not authorized, it is going to throw an access denied exception. So that exception indicates that this specific user, though this user is logged in, authenticated, but this given user is not authorized to access this specific request. For example, as I said, right, you're trying to access a specific resource where you don't have those kind of permissions. All right, now if I go to the decision manager, okay, so I will talk about this a little bit, but the overall framework is or the workflow, just to give you an idea, let me show you how the overall framework look like. This is what we have talked about so far. So we have access decision manager. This is an interface, and then there is an abstract access decision manager. This decision manager is responsible to take a decision whether you have the access to a given resource or not. Now within the Spring Security framework, there are different kind of access decision managers. Okay, there is a conscious based decision manager, there is a affirmative based decision manager, there is a unanimous based decision manager, and we will be talking about these during, as I said, in the later lessons. But there is not a single access decision manager. Okay, each decision manager, whether it's a affirmative based, or it's a unanimous based, or a conscious based decision managers, they rely onto the voter mechanism. Okay, for example, there are voters. So what it does is, every voter, so every decision manager will have a list of the voters. Okay, and these voters will vote, and they will tell whether they are approving it, or they think that this specific request is rejected. Based upon these different voters, the access decision manager will basically tally each and every vote, and then it basically give the final decisions. Okay, now the interesting part is, all these different types of the access decision managers, they have a different way to tell whether a given request is approved or a given request is rejected. For example, if I'm talking about this affirmative based access decision manager, so the way it works is, we can have a, let's say, 10 different voters. Those has been configured into affirmative based decision manager. But and then every voter can have three different results, and these are the numeric values. It can say access denied, it can say access given, and it can say I don't have any opinion. So I don't know whether, so it's a typically the typical election system, where either you say I like this candidate, I don't like this candidate, and the third one is I don't want to say anything, I'm neutral about this candidate, I don't have any opinion for this candidate. So it's typically the same architecture here. every voter will have their opinion and it is represented as a numeric value. These numbers will be tallied by the decision managers and the final call will be made. Now, as I said, every decision managers tally the total votes in a different way. The affirmative based will grant an access even if one of the voter is saying access granted. So for example, I have a 10 different voters. Out of those voters, if 9 are saying, let's say 5 are saying I don't have any opinion, 4 are saying access denied, but 1 is saying that access granted. So if we are using the affirmative based decision manager, and that's the default decision manager within the Spring Security that is activated, access will be granted. Okay. The conscious based works on a different base, anonymous based work on a different way, but that's the overall architecture, and we will be talking about these in more detail in our subsequent lessons. All right. So that's, I think, give you an overall idea about the how this works. And just to give you a more detailed idea, let me give you one more information. Okay, let me increase the size. All right, so take this as an example. This is a customer. Okay, so customer or a user is already authenticated. Now our interceptor, this filter security interceptor, will intercept the request, and then it is going to pass that information to the default access manager. Now default access manager is responsible to take the final call, but it can't take that call on its own. All it needs are the different voters whose responsibility uh, is to review the given request and then takes a call. It can basically take 3 decisions, as I said. Access abstain, that means it don't wants to give any opinion for a given request. That means I'm neutral. And the other two workflows are, they will say, okay, I'm giving access to this specific request, or it can say I don't want to give an access. Okay, I don't think this is a valid request. Now with all these voters, all the votes are passed, and then your decision manager will tally those votes. Okay, so this is basically highlighting the affirmative based decision manager. So if it finds any access granted, as I said, right, out of 10 even 1 is saying access granted, overall the access will be granted. Let's say if none of them is access granted, if any of them says access denied, then it throws an access denied exception, and then the overall customer will get that message which says, okay, sorry, this you are going to a restricted area or whatever it is. Okay, and then the if the access abstain, all of them is access abstain, and then this is the workflow. So that's, I think that might give you the high level idea how this works. These are not only the voters, there are other voters which are being used by the Spring Security, but this was just to give you an idea how this overall things works. So to better understand it, let's do one thing. We will run our application and then we will try to debug the workflow to see how these things are working. All right. So our application started. So what I have done is I have added a debugger point to our abstract security interceptor. Okay, now I'm quickly going to do a login. Going to bring this up, and then I'm going to do a login. Before login, I'm going to put the debugger here. Okay, all right, all good. Let's do a login. All right, so if you see the authentication object here, right, let's open this one just for yours. Okay, so if you see the authentication, my authentication have all the details. Who is the principal? Because I'm logged in already, everything is done by our custom user detail service. Our authorities contains the customer. All right, because that's what we are filling into our customer user detail service. within this one. Okay, what are the groups, and we are just pulling the groups and filling it. Okay, so my authentication object contains all the information. It is authenticated. It has the list of the authorities. It could be 0, it can be 10, 20, 30, 40. Okay, whatever it is. The other thing which, let's pull that quickly, are application security configuration. And this is interesting in the sense that this basically dictates what is the endpoint and what kind of authority the customer should carry in order to access this endpoint. It does not talk about the authentication process. Okay, means in the sense that it carries that information, but this information is not carrying that specific. So it says that okay, this should be authenticated, but it does not say what after the authentication. That's where these configuration will get into picture. So what it is saying is any access to account and then any other pattern should have authority as in customers. If it doesn't have that authority, it will be rejected by the authorization process. All right, so let's get back to our decision manager, and now I'm going to get into the decision manager. Okay, so if you remember, that's what I was talking about, the affirmative based decision manager. Okay, and now every decision manager, so this is the implementation, this is one of the implementation of the access decision manager by Spring Security, which is affirmative based. It talks about the decide method. Basically tells that whether what is the final decision. Okay, apart from that, there are few other methods. For example, where is the method in the abstract decision manager, whether it can handle a given request or not. But don't worry about that one, we will be talking about that a lot. But this only, we are now focusing only onto the high level workflow. Okay, so let's go here, and now it's going to fetch all the available voters that is configured for a given decision manager. So let's see what is the voter. Right now there is only one voter, and which is the web expression voter. This is a different voter that is configured when you use a Spring EL language. Okay, expression language. So this is nothing but a EL based configuration. So in order to understand the EL, Spring EL expression language, its context and all sort of things, Spring Security have a different voter, and which is the expression handler. Okay, which is a web expression voter. Okay, now if you see the result within this one, it basically only pass a result as access granted or denied or abstain, and this is what I was talking about. So the results are access granted, access denied, and then if denied is greater than 0, all it is doing is throwing an exception. Okay, so if you interested, let's get into this one, web expression, and then it basically does a lot of things, and we will be talking about that later on, but I don't want to get into those details. Okay, all it does is it basically pass a result which says 1. Okay, so 1 means the access is granted because I'm authorized, I have authority as a customer, and now everything works fine. Okay, so that's given us an high level of idea what is our entry point. So for example, if you want to debug everything working fine, but you are still getting an error message saying access not granted, you don't have an authorization, you know that what is your entry point for debugging. So your abstract security interceptor is your entry point. Within the access security interceptor, we have a access decision manager, which is responsible to take a final call whether a given request is authorized or not. And then within the decision managers, there are different implementations. Every decision manager is dependent onto the voters, which tell the decision manager whether a given request is allowed or not. And then decision manager tallies the vote if even if you look into the affirmative ways, right, it basically have a count deny, and then every based upon the result of each voter, it basically increase or decrease the deny access. And then if deny is more than one, it basically send a result as a access denied exception. So I hope this give you the starting point, or at least the basic understanding of the authorization framework. We are going to focus a lot onto the authorization framework, where we are going to talk about the different components of it. If you like my series, if you like my tutorials, please don't forget to share and subscribe to my channel.